I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind.
Hello there, and a very warm welcome to my YouTube channel this evening. My name's Chris, and I'm taking a look at the Horsa Glider. This is a follow-on from my previous film, looking at gliders in general from the wartime. But this is the Horsa in particular, and if you stick around until the very end, you'll find it very interesting what and how some people converted the Horsa after the war because there were so many left over. So sit back, have a cup of tea, have a few biscuits. The Horsa Glider was designed in 1940, was built by Airspeed, but subsequently was contracted out to other companies to manufacture. It was first flown on September the 12th, 1941. Production began in the June of 1942. The Horsa Glider had a wingspan of 88 feet and weighed 8,370 pounds empty. It was an all-wooden construction and fabric covered. Two models of the Horsa Glider. The Mark I was the troop version, 67 feet long. It carried 2 pilots and 20 to 25 troops with varying amounts of equipment. The load capacity was 15,500 pounds with a payload of 7,000 pounds in the Mark II. Well, the Mark II was the second version with a hinged nose for loading of equipment straight away to eliminate having to wrestle equipment sideways through the side door. It was 67 feet long and weighed 15,750 pounds, and it was the gross weight was close to 15,250 pounds. The Horsa was used quite extensively during the invasion of Normandy. It was used in Holland and the invasion of Germany for the Rhine crossing. Loading and unloading the first Horsa was difficult, as it was so far off the ground a jeep had to be pushed up a steel ramp and turned 90 degrees to get it inside. Though the Model 2 version had the hinged nose for a straight-in loading of the equipment, the floor was more than 3 feet above the ground. Getting equipment out of the Horsa took quite a lot of time. Experiments were tried using cordite explosive to blow the tail off, so equipment could be offloaded faster. The cordite was wrapped around the bolts holding the tail section to the fuselage. However, in most cases the cordite did not ignite and the tail had to be unbolted. Generally, removing the bolts took a lot of time and it was extremely hazardous as the aircraft was in the enemy ground fire position. Now, I read from an article from the Air Mobility Command Museum, and this is all about James DePietro's experience as a glider pilot. This is from a first-hand account, and James DePietro was a CG-4 glider pilot in World War II. He joined the army in 1941 and was initially assigned to a medical training unit as a laboratory technician. While on KP duty, one day his first sergeant asked him if he wanted to be a glider pilot. DePietro jumped at the chance and without actually knowing what a glider pilot was. After passing his interviews and tests, he began flying training on small airplanes and then onto small gliders. Now, following all his training, he boarded the Queen Mary in New York, which sailed and landed in Glasgow in Scotland. From there, he boarded a train from Membury down in England. And Membury is a small town not too far from London with a large airfield and some old army barracks in the middle of a farming community. And here he trained with the airborne infantry and had to qualify in every weapon from a .45 automatic to a .50 caliber machine gun. We were also checked out in the British Horsa Glider. The Horsa was a large plywood glider designed to carry 29 fully equipped airborne infantrymen. And this is the glider I eventually flew into Normandy on D.DAY. 2 weeks before Normandy invasion, we were restricted to the base, where we were briefed and shown maps and mosaics of the beautiful fields where we were to land in Normandy. Top secret, we were told. Our instructions were, after we were to land, to assemble with all the troops in the area and proceed to the command post with an airborne infantry officer in charge. The command post was a few miles southeast of Saint-Mère-Église. While on the ground, we were infantrymen with priority in being evacuated after the badly wounded. 0 hour at 11 p.m. on June the 5th, 1944. We were all assembled on the flight line when the commanding officer announced over the loudspeaker that the beautiful fields we'd been briefed on were reoccupied by the Germans. that when we got a green light from the tow ship to cut off and land, apparently the tow pilots had some additional briefing. It was too late to ask questions. The planes were already warming up and the gliders were being hooked up. It was time to take off. My flight took off in the early morning. We were assigned a Horsa and I was to be co-pilot. As soon as we took off, we noticed that the left wing felt heavy. We trimmed it as much as possible. It helped a little bit, but we still had to fight it all the way to Normandy. We had 29 men aboard, fully equipped. Sitting right behind me, a GI of a Greek descent was telling me what he was doing to the Germans, what he was going to do to the Germans when he landed. He was mad at them for what they'd done to his relatives in Greece. It was just before daylight when we flew over Omaha Beach. The tow plane began to lose altitude and we looked it over the train to spot a field big enough to land in. Any fields that were big enough to land in were staked with 4x4 6 feet high stakes and crisscrossed with barbed wire. We got the green light from the tow plane while we were about 200 feet, nowhere to land. We knew that if we didn't release the tow line soon, the tow pilots would release from the other end, and besides we were getting some ground fly. We finally saw 2 small fields divided by a hedgerow, so we cut off and began our approach to the closer of the 2 fields. Our plan was to dive towards the trunks of the trees, picking up enough speed to hop over the hedgerow and land in the next field. We were about 20 feet off the ground with the airspeed of 145 miles an hour, heading for the trunks of the trees. At the appropriate time, we both pulled back on the wheel to hop over the top. The nose of the glider would not come up, probably because it was overloaded or the left wing did not respond to the controls. We suddenly made a 90-degree turn, scraping the left wing on the ground. The forward momentum of the glider drove it into the hedgerow, colliding with one of the biggest trees broadside on the right. The greatest impact was just behind where I was sitting. The glider split open and rolled over on top of the trees, and most of us landed in the next field. I'd been thrown from the glider, and when I quit rolling about 25 yards from the impact, I noticed that my seat bottom was still attached to me. Much to my surprise, I was not hurt. A couple of scratches on my forehead, caused by my helmet when I hit my head. Besides, my seat remaining attached to me and my crash helmet are what prevented me from serious injury. And the most interesting thing was the Mae West also helped, which I wore under my flak suit that inflated on impact and acted as a cushion when I landed and rolled on the ground. After assuring myself that I was all in one piece, I surveyed the damage. Ben Ward, who was the other pilot, was walking around in a daze. He must have hit his head, but he came to when I yelled at him. We then counted noses. There was 1 man missing. We went back to the other field and found him all crumpled up at the trunk of the tree. He was the Greek GI who sat behind me during the flight. He must have taken the full impact of the crash and was the only one who did not survive. The team of medics took care of a few broken bones and other minor injuries. The rest of us assembled on a nearby country road and proceeded towards Saint-Mère-d'Église, which was between us and the command post. I will continue the account that James DiPietro gave of his wartime experience, and we continue with, when we finally began our march towards the command post, the lieutenant in charge wasn't sure we were going in the right direction. I saw a farmer milking a cow in a nearby field. I went over to him and in my high school French asked him if Saint-Mère-d'Église was in that direction. As I pointed where we headed, he said yes and volunteered the information that about an hour previous some German paratroopers had landed on the hill up ahead. I relayed the information to the lieutenant in charge. He in turn ordered the troops to spread out and be on the alert. There were about 200 of us in the group. As we approached the hill, we were fired on with automatic burp guns. We hit the deck and looked around, but couldn't see anyone. The firing ceased and we continued on. A short time later, we heard the rumble of tanks, American tanks, and their machine guns, and then they rumbled on. Under scattered sniper fire, we finally arrived at the command post without further casualties. We're going to move on now to slightly post-war, when some enterprising builders decided to convert some Horsa gliders into various homes and accommodation.
I'm a private builder, and permanent construction on houses today is more or less at a standstill. This is owing to the fact of the shortage of materials and supplies, and in order to keep the men fully occupied, we have turned to something else, which in this case is the conversion of these glider bodies into caravans.
The Horsa Gliders were stripped of all their wartime bits and pieces and converted very slowly into mobile homes, caravans and ancillary accommodation that people could put in their gardens and utilise when people came to stay. This was really post-war utilisation of wartime leftover Horsa Gliders, other various bits and pieces, because the materials were in great shortage after the end of the Second World War, and also there was a good way for some of these building companies to give their men and staff some added work and produce these very, very useful, but I guess sadly there will not be too many of these left around. But in any event, I really hope you enjoyed looking at this brief look back at the Horsa Glider, its wartime activities and everything that followed on just after the Second World War. I look forward to seeing you on the next film. Do ponder having a subscribe. Take the greatest of care. All the very best for now. Cheers.